Branding, 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 branding. Everybody is talking about branding. Everybody has a definition, but what is it really? Because in the industry, I see so much definitions that are so vague. So I sometimes wonder what it's like for a client to perceive this industry and to know what he's buying. So that's why in this video, I want to walk you through what I think is wrong with some of the definitions, and of course give you my own definition that is really actionable and doable. But before we get to my definition, it's a good idea, I think, to look at some of the definitions that are out there to get an idea of how branding is perceived inside and outside of the industry. So one of the definitions I can see outside of the industry is this definition by entrepreneur.com, and it says that branding is the marketing practice of creating a name, symbol, or design that identifies and differentiates a product from other products. I think it's a fairly good definition. I mean, it has a lot of components that are really crucial to branding. First off, they say it's a part of marketing, but it's something that identifies. And I think that identification is really important. And also, of course, they mention differentiation, making sure that a product can stand out and can be recognized. I'd rather call that distinctiveness, but in the end, I think it's a core function of what branding is about. So from the outside world, from an entrepreneur's perspective, for example, I think this is already a good understanding. So there's a lot more definitions from the outside world, but usually it boils down to a couple of these things. First, branding is a part of marketing. Branding is identification. Branding is about visual differentiation. And sometimes branding is compared to just logo design or identity design. And that's where a lot of branding people can get agitated. It's not just a logo! And so let's take a look at the inside world. Like, how do we as an industry talk about branding? We can see that in the industry, people talk about branding in really big ways, that it's a lot more than just this part of marketing that is creating some visual assets. It's really like there's a lot of big talk when it comes to branding. So branding is your why. I see that often. Branding is what customers say about you. That's related to the definition of brand by Marty Neumeyer, for example. Branding is creating meaning. Branding is long-term. Branding is brand. Well, that's weird, but I can see it pop up here and there, that this confusion between branding and brand. So look at our industry. I mean, there's so many Instagram carousels and videos on what branding is. And of course, all our industry leaders have talked about that. Chris Do and Marty Neumeyer and a lot of other people. And I think there's something wrong with a lot of these definitions because they are too vague and they are not always talking about branding as a discipline, which is worrisome for me. If we look at it at this spectrum, you have on the left side, I think what a lot of people see as branding is almost it's everything. It's marketing, it's communication, it's advertising, it's strategy, it's like a container word for everything, and I think that's troublesome. On the other hand, maybe that's where the definition gets a little bit too thin, and that's where branding is your logo, which of course it's not, but I think we can get past that now. I think we've seen plenty of discussions about that, and I think by now clients already also understand that branding is more than your logo. But I think as an industry, maybe we overshoot a little bit and now we are too broad, and so we need to hone it back in, guys. Get back to reality. So before we dive into my definition, here's my beef with a lot of the branding definitions that come from our own industry. First, I think it's so hard to understand for clients. If somebody wants to hire a branding agency and they come to your website and it's branding is your why, branding is how customers feel about you, what does that tell the client about what you're going to do for them? What is your discipline? What is your craft? What is your service you're offering? I mean, it can get really vague, and so it means that branding can do everything for everyone, which is easy because that allows gurus to talk about branding in this way. But it's also something that's problematic, I think, for us as an industry. So I think, first off, getting clients to understand what we do is part of getting them on board and seeing the value of what we do. Also, another part that's I think tricky is that it's really hard for people getting into the industry. It's hard to learn what branding is if we talk about it in this really vague way. Because if branding is your why, I mean, then there's so much to learn, because why can go into business strategy, brand strategy, brand purpose, marketing, communication, advertising. I think it's overwhelming for somebody that wants to get into branding if we give them too broad of a definition. And then lastly, it's hard to separate branding from marketing, from brand strategy, from all these other things if we make it too vague. Like what is the value of these other disciplines? I'm sure that people in marketing know that they don't have all the branding skills, and vice versa. And I think we need to get rid of this attitude that branding is like the over-encompassing thing that makes all the rest of the world tick, because it's not. I mean, let's be honest. So enough with the dissing of other definitions and people talking about branding. I think it's great that as an industry we try to figure out what branding is about, and we try to understand that it's more than just logo or graphic design. And I for a fact believe that too, but like, what is it then? And I set out to create my own definition that is actionable, understandable. So let's just dive into it. Branding is the deliberate, continuous process of developing observable, distinctive assets associated with a product or service. Whew, it's a huge definition, right? I want to break it down into each word, because each word in that definition has a function that's important for you to know. So first off, branding is a deliberate effort. So it means that it's something we do consciously. It's a discipline. It's an act of branding that is intentional. So of course you might have a brand whether you're doing branding or not, and you might have a reputation, and you might even have like visual assets that are part of your brand. But the act of branding as a discipline is something we do deliberately. We know that we are doing branding. So it's a deliberate, continuous effort. So continuous means that it's not a one-time thing. Of course, branding projects often are this, for example, rebrand or creating the brand, but then it doesn't stop there. Branding is a continuous effort. So you need to keep on working on the brand, evolving the assets, fine-tuning, creating, and you need to do that based on the consumer's perception of the brand. So that's where that definition of Marty Neumeyer or other people that say that branding is about what customers say is really important. I mean, you need to understand how people perceive your product or service, and you need to see that branding is a layer in between that. And if you understand how they perceive that, you can improve your branding. Can get a little bit splitting hairs sometimes, but I think it's important. Okay, so it's a deliberate, continuous process. So branding doesn't happen randomly. It's a process with well-defined stages, building on a validated strategy process that enables a creative output. So it's not strategy, but it's a process that comes after that, and it has well-defined steps. So I think that's important as well. So when we work with clients, they know we're gonna work with them in a staged way, and it's not gonna be like randomly just maybe picking a new color or doing something, or maybe talking about positioning but not doing anything else. I think that process is really important. So it's a deliberate, continuous process of developing, and so developing means that it's not just about creating new assets. It's a deliberate choice of investing in certain assets and downgrading others. And if you want to learn more about this, choosing what assets you need to grow, what assets you need to kill, what assets you need to improve. That I think one really interesting book tip here by Jenny Romaniuk, which is like the best book on branding, I think, is where she explains that building distinctive brand assets is a strategy that's really important. So it's a deliberate, continuous process of developing observable. And so observable is a really important word, because branding is a translation between brand strategy and the actual touch points consumers see. Things like positioning, business goals are not directly noticeable So branding is that translations of making that brand strategy visible in a way, visible or tangible, or I mean in some way it needs to be sensory. So it's not that branding is just like graphics. It can be a lot. So it's not that branding is just like graphics. It can be smell or sound or whatever. I mean, it's a lot of things, but it is observable. So things like brand strategy is not observable. That's not branding yet. Distinctive. I mentioned the book before by Jenny Romaniuk. So distinctiveness is key in brand building, in marketing, in everything. I think it's one of the things we underestimate in value of branding. I think we want to make branding about meaning too much, while distinctiveness is making sure that you get recognized easily. It means not being confused with competitors. It means being recognized as your company, as your product, as your service. It means that you are in some way visually very recognizable and also distinctively different from your competitors. So distinctiveness is really key to branding. When you're creating any type of marketing efforts, advertising, communication, and the brand is not recognized, you're throwing money down the drain. So that's an example of the value of having a distinctive brand. It's when you immediately recognize that brand and you associate it with the right traits. So branding is that deliberate, continuous process of developing observable, distinctive assets. An asset is a resource to the company. Branding is about developing assets that have a clear return on investment. They're not just creative ideas. They are quantifiable assets on a company's balance sheet. So I think the moment you start looking at these distinctive assets as actual assets for a company, you will understand that just doing a rebrand or, oh, that logo is ugly, that's not a good idea, because every time there's an ad published, every time there is something people see that they associate with your brand, there is a relation that gets enforced. And so you as a branding expert need to understand that these assets need to be assessed really well before you just dump them and rebrand for the fun of it. There's a lot of examples where these things really went wrong and sales dropped immediately after a bad branding effort. So that's something key to understand. And so these assets are associated, and association works on different levels. First off, branding needs to work unconsciously. And I think that's something that is so important to branding that we often forget, the unconscious level. What are we signaling to a person? What are we making them feel without them having to think what the meaning is? They don't read a message, they see a brand and they feel something immediately. That's your unconscious thinking, that's your automatic thinking that almost immediately picks up on what kind of brand this is, what kind of product this is, what the perceived quality is. So again, this unconscious level is something we cannot forget. And if we go too far into thinking that branding is purpose or meaning or why, we tend to focus on messages, on rational convention of we are different because X, while in reality, branding is a lot more about what you're signaling by the type of paper, typography, color, the way you use white space, everything that is crucial to branding. But there is, of course, also that conscious level. Branding, picking a name, making sure there is meaning, making sure the messages, the tone of voice have the right feeling that fit. The unconscious level is important to make sure that there's no split between those two. So it's balancing those two. And of course, these assets are associated with a product or service. I mean, in the end, branding is a way of making sure the product or service you sell has the proper perceived quality and associations. Whether that's yogurt or financial services, it doesn't really matter. So, to recap, branding is the deliberate, continuous process of developing observable, distinctive assets associated with a product or service. So I just want to recap what I think is important. First, I think we need to acknowledge our value as an industry. What is branding worth for a company, and what is branding actually? What can clients expect and how will we work? I think that's crucial. We also need to know what we're not. I think that's also important. When people pay for branding, what are they getting? And so I think that's crucial. Branding is a ridiculously powerful tool, but for the right reasons. I think we have forgotten along the way how important it is to actually create these visual or sensory assets. Sometimes it's like we've become afraid of the dirty work of doing actual design and forgetting that that type of design, the way we select these things, is actually a craft that is something that's worth sometimes a hell lot more than inventing a purpose for a brand. I'm not saying that's not important, but I think the strategy, the brand strategy, is something that comes before that. And even in brand strategy, it's not just about meaning or purpose, but that's again a whole other video. And I recommend reading How Brands Grow if you're interested in this little friction thing what I'm talking about. But so lastly, I think branding is not the end all be all for business. It has a role to play, but we need to understand where we sit in relation to marketing, to business strategy, to brand strategy. And if we understand that properly, we can play our role well and we can play out our value well. But if we start reaching out for the stars and try to be everything for everyone, I think as an industry, we're gonna fail. One last note, if you do want to learn more about what brand strategy is, I have a similar video where I talk about a definition of brand strategy and also how that relates to branding and marketing. So check it out if you want to. Thanks for watching. And if you like this video, please subscribe and hit that bell if you want to get notified for the next video. Take care.